Hello, and welcome to the International Society for Science and Religions, ISSR, YouTube channel. My name is Anthony Nairn, and I'm the Executive Assistant of ISSR. Today, I am pleased to introduce what we are hoping will be the first episode in a running series, which will have ISSR Fellows in conversation with one other scholar or fellow on topics related to research, interests, matters of issue, and other such topics. We hope that this series will appeal to both academics and to the general public alike. We're proponents of the free and open exchange of ideas, and believe that sharing such exchanges of ideas and knowledge, like this, through conversation is a critical way to bring forth a more wise and approachable use value for claims made in the Academy to the general public. Today, I bring to you a timely conversation. As you may know, on 26 December of 2021, E.O. Wilson died at the age of 92. Edward Osborne Wilson was the Pellegrino University Research Professor Emeritus of Entomology at Harvard University. He was, however, most well known outside of biology for his book Sociobiology: A New Synthesis, which was released in 1975. This new synthesis, while at its core not a new idea, was released amidst a more diverse political landscape, one that would play heavily into the controversy surrounding the text. Yet, because of the reach of the text, controversy swirled inside the Academy as well, especially from the social sciences of anthropology and sociology. The controversy surrounding sociobiology aside, Wilson was a prolific writer, winning 2 Pulitzer Prizes for general nonfiction, and a winner of many other awards and prizes throughout his long career within and outside of the Academy, from professional science organizations to communication platforms like TED, to communication awards like the Carl Sagan Award for Public Understanding of Science. While never directly addressing the field of science and religion, Wilson's work and life often touched upon it. Sociobiology would claim that religion is a naturally selected behavior, and his work, Consilience, attempted to bring together the sciences and the humanities. And his work in The Creation, Wilson asked for religious and scientific leaders to come together to tackle climate change. Today's talk brings ISSR Fellow Michael Ruse, the Lucille T. Werkmeister Professor and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science program at Florida State University, together with ISSR President Michael Reiss, Professor of Science Education at University College London. Please enjoy this episode of ISSR's In Conversation.
Michael, really good to see you as always.
And you too, Michael.
Thank you very much. Now, look, you knew Ed Wilson much better than I did. So let's start by just telling me a bit about your memories of him as a person.
Okay, I first met Ed Wilson, I think, in 1979, maybe 1980. I had a former student who was an untenured junior faculty member at Harvard. And so my wife and I went to stay with him, and he said, "You must go and meet Ed Wilson." Now, why would he think I might want to meet Ed Wilson? Mainly, well, completely because although Ed Wilson was an ant specialist, and I'm sure we can go back over his career earlier, he, in 1975, had produced this absolutely massive book, Sociobiology: The New Synthesis, where what he was doing right from as it were, from ants to humans, he was trying to show that not only are we social animals, but that this is very directly controlled by evolution through natural selection. As it happens, this was the red flag for a number of left-wing biologists, including people in his own department, Dick Lewontin, and none other than Stephen Jay Gould, who by 1980 was already, rapidly on the rise to becoming probably the most prominent evolutionist in the world after Richard Dawkins. They can wrestle over that one themselves. So I'm an Englishman, as you can tell from my accent. And even before the Marxists started to get all involved, I read Wilson and I said, "Oh my goodness, yeah, I mean, I don't agree with everything he wants to say, but yeah, this is the approach." Now, why did I take that approach? Because I'd grown up in the 1950s watching things like The Brains Trust on the BBC, which had people like Julian Huxley and JBS Haldane, good leftists, I mean, Haldane was a Marxist, who took it as absolutely a priori given that we humans are part of the process. That obviously there's going to be different things. I mean, we're going to speak and elephants don't speak. Elephants have big trunks and we don't. But, you know, we're all part of the overall picture. So it never dawned on me. And of course, you know, I read Darwin and The Descent of Man. So it never dawned on me that it would be ideologically unacceptable to take Darwinism and apply it to humans. I mean, as I say, there's lots of places you might want to argue about this, whether or not, for instance, are women superior or equal or less? I mean, you can spend a lot of time arguing about that. We still do. But the idea that, let's say, the differences between men and women has nothing to do with biology just never crossed my mind. And so I gave a paper, and then I started in writing a book. And as you can imagine, oh my God, hell descended on me. It was a little bit like global warming plus. And the interesting thing was that I won't say all of the philosophers, but almost all of the philosophers were on the Marxist side. I mean, I don't say that they were Marxists, but they were very strongly on the side of, yes, humans are different, that sort of thing. And so I found myself on the outs of my fellow philosophers as well. So as I say, I mean, I didn't go to Harvard to meet Wilson. I went to Harvard to stay with and visit my former student and be taken around Boston and that sort of thing. But he said, we must go and meet Wilson, and I did. And Wilson was, as always, very charming. He'd heard of me because, I'd made sure to send him stuff. I mean, this was pre-email, but, there was still, the postal service worked in those days. And so he knew about me. I mean, he didn't know much about me. I knew a lot more about him than he knew about me. But he was very friendly and very warm and that sort of thing. I will say one thing, we can pick up on this later. He had on the wall a picture of Herbert Spencer, which was considerably more prominent and larger than his picture of Charles Darwin. I should say also, the biggest picture on his wall was of Ed Wilson getting the US Medal of Science from Jimmy Carter, the then president, but he got his priorities right. But I said to him, I think I said Professor Wilson, I might even at those days have said Ed, Herbert Spencer, great man, Mike, great man. I want to pick up on that later. Anyhow, we got on well, but I thought that was probably the end of it. Then what happened was I got involved in the next, I mean, I like controversies. And so I got involved in the next year. I say I like controversies. Michael Reiss, you know about this because we're writing a book on the new biology, and that's very controversial. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I like to do, and obviously you like to do. So anyhow, the next year, my attention was directed to the creationist issue. And creationism was a big thing. Henry Morris and Duane T. Gish, author of Evolution, the Fossils Say No, 150,000 copies sold, and so on and so forth. And so I got involved in this. And you may remember, Michael, because you're a very old man, but our audience won't remember, but 1981, the state of Arkansas, that's one of the southern states, passed a law saying, if you're going to teach evolution in the state-funded public schools, I mean, by public school, I don't mean the English private school, I mean state finance, like grammar schools and that sort of thing. If you're going to teach evolution, then you also had to teach creationism, balanced treatment. Well, of course, the American Civil Liberties Union went, Ep1, whatever it is we call it in those days, and said, no, this is a violation of the First Amendment, separation of church and state. They brought a case against it, and they started to line up expert witnesses. And I've already mentioned Steve Gould, and he was one. And again, for you folks, Langdon Gilkey, who was at the time, I mean, he's dead now, but the most eminent Protestant theologian in America, was another. And they agonized did they need a philosopher or not? And the way that they were doing this was they got Skadden Arps, a very big firm in New York, which was happy to work with them on a pro bono basis because it was good advertising for Skadden Arps. And they got one of the partners used one of his assistants, and he phoned somebody at Princeton. I mean, this is the level they worked, and said, "Give me a list of 3 or 4 philosophers who might be of value in this." And so, he started phoning them. At the end of his phone call, he'd say, "Give me a couple more names." Well, it wasn't long before my name started to come up, and at least it partly serendipitous because not only was I there and I'd worked on Darwin, so I was sort of pre-adapted to this, but also the most prominent person who might have been I won't say my rival, my other, as it were, was David Hull, who, as he made no bones about this, was gay. And he was he said, "I don't want to be up there on a witness stand in Arkansas, because they're going to bring up my sexual orientation before we finish the first sentence." He said, "Please understand, I'm not hiding it, I'm proud of my sexual orientation. But there are times when I realize that discretion is the better form of valor." So it ended with me at a small young university in Canada, that I found myself going down to Arkansas to be the expert witness for philosophy. I should say they agonized right up almost until the moment I got on the stand as to whether or not they needed a philosopher. I mean, it's one thing to have Gould tell them about the fossil record. It's another thing for philosophers who, as you can tell, first of all, we can't shut up, so we're not good on stand. We want to lecture everybody. But secondly, philosophers, well, it depends if you look at it this way, it depends if you look at it that way. But fortunately, they found somebody who was quite happy to wade in and say, creation science is not science. I'm not a Popperian, but Popper was the big thing. I said, it's not falsifiable. I mean, I should say my fellow philosophers, after I did this, all descended on me, even more than the Marxists for doing this. But anyhow, we were successful. And I don't know whether this or not, but I always felt the next year I got a Guggenheim Fellowship, which certainly Americans will know is just about the most prestigious fellowship that you can apply for and get. I mean, maybe a MacArthur gives you more money, but the Guggenheim, and I got one. I've always felt that it was very much almost a thank you to me for standing up for evolution. I mean, I think I'd earned it. I mean, I'm not, but anyhow. So I thought, then what am I going to do? I've got a year off. So I got in touch with Wilson and said, "What about my coming and spending a sabbatical with you?" As it happens, I then discovered that Wilson was the head of the Guggenheim Grant Commission, so it was a good choice. Anyhow, I ended up spending a year down with Ed Wilson. When I say I was in his lab, I wasn't in his lab. I mean, God, I'm a philosopher. What do I have to do with ants? But over the year, we decided to write a couple of papers, and we did. We wrote a couple of papers on evolution and ethics, because Ed was, this was our, the place where we, as it were, overlapped. And we wrote a couple of papers, and we got them published, and they were fairly high publicity. So what I'm saying is that this forged a bond, as it were, between me and Ed. And at the time, my present wife, I was there with my present wife. I was a 43-year-old full professor. She was a 20-year-old undergraduate. And I said to Ed, I have to tell you, I have a somewhat, let us say, irregular family situation. It's not normal, but and he looked at me and smiled and said, "Oh, Mike, you with a younger woman, it's perfectly normal. It's perfectly normal." I should say Ed Wilson would be the last person ever to find himself in that sort of situation. Anyhow, it not only forged a bond between me and Ed, but between me and Lizzie, my wife. And interestingly, later on, when we got our third child and we were agonizing over what to call him, we decided, why not call him Ed? So
that's really nice. That's really nice. I didn't know that last bit. You must have met him there for about the time I did, because I was very fortunate. He'd come over to England, and was doing some work at Cambridge, and my PhD supervisor, Tim Clutton-Brock, who at the time was working on Red Deer, invited me to dinner with him. And I was slightly in awe because this was a good sort of 5-6 years after sociobiology had been published. And I can remember when that extraordinarily large book was published, because I was then just starting my undergraduate career. And I couldn't afford to buy the book because in English money, I can still remember, I'm fairly sure it cost £16 because it was a mammoth tome, as you will remember, and initially was only in hardback. And I can remember trying to persuade, I think because I wanted her to be my girlfriend, somebody to go halves on it, but she wasn't having any of that. So I had to wait until my mother gave it to me as a Christmas present. But I mean, you've already alluded to sociobiology. I think that was the book that in the public's mind is still probably more associated with him than any other, even though 2 others of his books won the Pulitzer Prize and so on. Can you say a bit about the impact of any of his writing that you felt, not just on narrow academia, but on the public more generally, Mike?
Yes. Well, let's pull back a little bit. Ed did his PhD at Harvard in the 1950s. He'd been an undergraduate, I think, at the University of Alabama. He was a Southerner. But he ended up at Harvard, got his PhD, and then got a job at Harvard as a junior professor. A year before Jim Watson came, Jim Watson of double helix. And I rather gather there were 2 egos at work there, because Ed has referred to Jim Watson as the most unpleasant human being he's ever met in his whole life, because Watson was all for molecularizing everything, where Ed was an organismic biologist. I mean, this, in a way, this makes the whole Marxist thing so ridiculous, because of all the people who was an anti-reductionist, it was Ed Wilson. He was the one who was saying, you've got to take whole organisms seriously. You cannot, I mean, yes, of course, I'm not against molecular biology, but to think that molecular biology is the beginning and the end and the middle is just wrong. So, as I say, but in the 1960s, Ed got involved with a man called Robert MacArthur at Princeton, and they worked on biogeography, particularly island biogeography, and how often they get invaded and how they settle and that sort of thing. And this set a pattern for Ed, because Ed always liked, he was the, as it were, the field biologist, the organismic biologist, but he always liked to work with, let's say, a technical expert. And MacArthur was a mathematician. And so it was a perfect fusion. And they wrote on island biogeography. And to this day, I don't think any evolutionary biologist, any biologist, would deny that this was a major, major achievement.
No,
so by the time we go,
I agree.
Well,
I can remember that book very well, because my mathematics is reasonably okay, and it's a beautifully mathematically produced argument. And he was good at choosing his co-authors. They complemented each other, as you say. And it was very important in a number of studies, because at the time, the common assumption among conservation biologists was that if you had a choice between a single big reserve and a number of small nature reserves of the same total area, the obvious thing was to go for the number of small reserves, because they'd have a greater variety of habitats, so you'd have more species. And of course, what they argued is, well, you might have more species to start with, but you would lose species at a greater rate from the smaller reserves, and they wouldn't be recolonized. So as well as being influential among academic biologists, it really had quite a transformative effect on conservation biology, and still to this day does.
So, yes, I think you're absolutely right. But the point is, by the 1970s, Ed Wilson wasn't just another prof at Harvard. He was pretty high profile by then. And as I say, I think that this was a pattern that Ed liked. And the final work that he did in the late 90s with Bert Holdover, where they got their second Pulitzer Prize on ants. Well, Ed was very much the, as it were, overall vision man, if you like, whereas Bert was the guy who was, molecular, but certainly the close detail morphologist. That's, that is not to knock Ed and to say Ed didn't do this. That wasn't the kind of work that he did. But his genius was to find somebody who did do that, who probably themselves would not make any splash at all. I mean, whether anybody would have heard of MacArthur without Wilson, I don't know. But the point is, it was a very happy symbiotic relationship like that. Now, the reason why I mention this is that Ed was at Harvard and Dick Lewontin had been an undergraduate at Harvard. Then he went to Columbia to work with Theodosia Dobzhansky, the leading on fruit flies, and did very well. And then he got into molecular biology, and he was the one who discovered molecular variation in populations with gel electrophoresis and that sort of thing. And meanwhile, Dick was, as it were, working his way up. He was an undergrad at Harvard, grad at Columbia, then I think it was North Carolina assistant professor, University of Rochester associate professor, where incidentally I was a student and I met him for the first time, then full professor at Chicago, and then in the early 1970s, named professor at Harvard. And Ed was keen to get, I've always had the suspicion, Ed denies it, I've always had the suspicion that Ed rather hoped that he and Lewontin could collaborate. It would make perfectly good sense. I mean, Lewontin was the leading, as it were, molecular evolutionist of the day. I mean, he wasn't just a Jim Watson type. I mean, he'd been a student at Dobzhansky, so he was an evolutionist first and foremost. And I've always had the feeling that Ed thought, Dick can do, as it were, the genetic side, and I'll do the natural history side. As I say, Ed denies this, but I've still got that suspicion. So as I say, Wilson in the 1970s, as it were, turned more and more, and it wasn't just he, because in the 1960s, as you well know, Bill Hamilton, came up with some models for social behavior, and the whole area of social behavior changed from rather fuzzy, ethology in the 50s of group selection and all of these sorts of things and killer apes and that sort of thing. And in the 1960s got really properly professionalized with people like William Hamilton, Bill Hamilton, and probably the overall, as it were, guru was John Maynard Smith.
And you probably know that John was one of the two examiners of Bill Hamilton for his PhD. And when John read the thesis, of course, highly intelligent man, mathematically very capable, he just immediately realized the importance of what Hamilton was doing and rushed off and wrote a paper for Nature where he, John, introduced the phrase kin selection, which of course Darwin hadn't used. Darwin, as you know better than I do, had used family selection, and Bill Hamilton hadn't used it either because he was a typical nerdy mathematician, but John could communicate. And for quite a while, that produced a bit of tension between them because, not surprisingly, you're a doctoral student who's just got your doctorate, and then 12 months later, you find your key idea, in one sense, in a paper in Nature without you as a co-author, though that's being a bit unfair to John Maynard Smith. But the point is, I agree with you. What Hamilton did made intelligent people like Ed Wilson and John Maynard Smith realize how this could transform their discipline.
Yes, I don't think there's any doubt. And then who was the chap who did reciprocal altruism? Robert Trivers was a grad student at Harvard. Yeah. So Ed, the point is, it was, as it were, brought to Ed's attention, even if he'd not been interested. But as he said, he read Trivers and said, not Trivers, Hamilton, and said, "Oh my F God," although he would never ever use the F word. No. But yeah, oh my goodness. And of course, being Ed, that led to him working. And of course, it built up into this massive book that he published in the mid 70s. So, Ed would never say he was not the first sociobiologist. He was not the mathematician sociobiologist. But I do think, in absolute fairness, he was the great synthesizer. Yep. In a way that, he said, my book is modeled on Julian Huxley's Evolution. He said the title, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, Sociobiology, the New Synthesis. And he was quite open, that he was paying, as it were, tribute to Huxley for what he did in the early in the 1940s, where he took the whole neo-Darwinism synthetic theory had come along, and what Julian Huxley did was, as it were, synthesize it and give us the overall picture of what was going on. And I think that that's what Ed, wanted to do himself. I think, to be fair to Ed was more of a biologist than Huxley ever was. I think by the 30s, even the 20s, Huxley had pulled back from formal biology, and he was much more into what he did that big book with H.G. Wells and his son. And he became, what was it, first Secretary General of UNESCO, and that sort of thing. So I mean, he did what he did was wonderful, but he wasn't, as it were, a lab hands-on biologist. In a way that Ed was. And so, but as I say, it was what Ed did was very consciously, thinking back, 1930s, you had people like Fisher and Sewell Wright, and then Dubchansky and what they call him Henry Ford and others doing all this work. And Huxley saw, there's something here. I'm going to bring it together in a synthesis. And I think Ed was doing very much the same thing. He saw all of this in the 1960s. I mean, he was at Harvard. He was right at the edge of this. And then, as it were, he said, this is my field. I work with ants, and you can't get a more social species than ants. Let's do the big picture. And I will always say, if I'm going to give Ed credit, as it were, as the major biologist of his time, it would be sociobiology, the new synthesis, despite all the controversies. So that's where we're at there.
And on the controversy, I think it's really interesting because, as you mentioned, in many ways, Ed Wilson was a whole organism biologist. And yet, whether it's people read him in this way or whether he wrote in this way, as soon as sociobiology came out in 75, he was seen as a reductionist, as somebody not only as a reductionist, but as a rather naive reductionist who thought that everything to do with behavior, including human behavior, came down to these rather crude models that followed from genetics. Do you think that was fair or unfair?
I think it's both fair, but at a certain level misleading. I don't think there's any question that Ed, went into it pretty naively. Let's put it that way. He certainly didn't cover his backside against the attacks that were coming his way. And I think that when Lewontin and Gould, who don't forget we're in the same department, published this joint with a number of others, this letter in the New York Review of Books, after Ed's book had been very favorably reviewed by Conrad Waddington. They wrote, said it, it's, and I think Ed was completely blindsided by that one. But the point is, Michael, I think now, and I always thought, a lot of this was Harvard superegos. I mean, they were the paradigm of sociobiology at work. I mean, you had Ed already established there. He could only see out of one eye. He had a southern accent. He was a mild man at that level. You got Dick Lewontin, and if I say he was, from a New York Jewish background and very strong on this, who worked his way up back to Harvard. There was, it was almost foreordained that you were going to get, as it were, naked mud wrestling. Incidentally, can I just mention? I said from a Jewish background. This is an interesting side thing, which is worth bringing up. I remember Ernst Mayr pointing out to me, Ernst Mayr, the leading evolutionist. He said, Michael, the Science for the People group, that was the ones who were attacking Ed. He said, have you noticed that all of them are Jews? And I said, oh, yeah. Now, Ernst was German, but he'd left Germany before Hitler came to power. So, Mayr said, my feeling is that a lot of what's going on here is that a lot of these people like Lewontin are suffering from Holocaust guilt. Because, again, to pick up it was the 1960s that the Holocaust suddenly became big time because Israel had invaded, had taken over the West Bank. They needed some way to defend themselves. So, this was when Holocaust studies suddenly shot into you can't criticize, Israelis because of the Holocaust. And I think, let me put it this way. Ernst said, he said, I think a lot of these people are feeling guilt that they escaped the Holocaust because they grew up in comfortable middle-class families in New York City. And this is their way, as it were. And I actually asked Steve Gould about this because I knew Steve through the Arkansas thing. I asked Steve about this. He stopped for a moment and he thought, he said, I don't think it's the whole story, but yes, I think there's a significant truth to what Meyer said. He said, I do think that many of us, I don't even want to say all of us, are motivated by a feeling that this is something we can do for all those dead co-religionists, as it were. I mean, I don't think this is a bad thing. And I'm not. I mean, it's got nothing to do with Semitism or anti-Semitism. But as I say, Steve himself said, I think there was a major motivation there. So anyhow, as it were, so just to pick up, yeah, you're right. I think Ed was very naive about a lot of this, and as it were, got blindsided. What I think is really interesting is something which really only became really clear to the historians 20, 30 years later, by the time we get into this century, was that in fact, Ed Wilson, he was not, when I say he was deceptive, I don't mean he was living a double life. I don't mean he had one agenda but pretended to be something else. I mean, it was not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of thing. I mean, it wasn't that. But Ed, as I say, I'm getting unplugged just a moment. Ed, as I say, came from Harvard. He was educated at Harvard. Now, Harvard had a tradition, or Harvard biology, of organicism. And this goes back at least to the 1910s, 1920s, where people like William Morton Wheeler were huge Herbert Spencer groupies. Why wouldn't they be? Herbert Spencer had been far more popular in America than Charles Darwin at the time that these men were growing up, 1880, 1890, 1900. I mean, Spencer was the name. And I don't think there's any question that Ed, one of Ed's supervisor had as his supervisor Wheeler. So Ed was an intellectual grandchild of Wheeler. And I think, as the historians are now pointing out, in many respects, Ed Wilson was far more of an organicist than a mechanist, if I can put it that way. I mean, I don't mean he was anti-Darwin. Of course he was a Darwinian, but he saw things organically in a way, let's say, that I don't think John Maynard Smith ever did. To take an example. Go on.
And as you well know, it all blew up rather oddly because having had this sort of quite tight cabal of evolutionary biologists all on side about things like it's all individual selection, kin selection, reciprocal altruism. You mentioned Trivers earlier on, and group selection is just pathetic and can't possibly have any veracity. Another 15 years later, as you well know, we find E.O. Wilson with some other very good mathematicians beginning to write articles suggesting it's not as simple as that. And again, he was vilified, wasn't he?
Yeah, by his fellow evolutionists. He came out strongly and said, I think group selection, the idea that evolution works for the group rather than only for the individual. He said, I think group selection not only exists, but is a powerful evolutionary force. You're right. I mean, I think it was 146 evolutionary biologists penned a letter to Nature saying, Ed, you're full of it. And of course, Ed being Ed, loved every moment. Because apart from anything else, there wasn't the vitriolic, thing of the 70s. I mean, these were people disagreeing. But there were people disagreeing who could go off and have a drink afterwards. I'm not sure that Ed ever would, but you know what I mean. He'd be very happy to sit down and have a Starbucks with you after the argument. I think it worked that way. So I think the point you're making is very important. Now, you've asked me, because I want to swing back in a moment.
Well, I think it's a good point because you're quite positive there about how that controversy might have affected the individuals, and I'm encouraged of what you said about how Ed Wilson might have reacted to that famous letter in Nature. But I'm pretty confident that a lot of the people penning it simply thought he was past it. You know, here's a chap who's 20 years older than I am. He doesn't know any mathematics, pathetic. And I think they were deeply condescending. And then, as you know very well, being both a historian and philosopher, pendula tend to swing. And now, looking back, it doesn't seem quite as clear-cut as those
No,
opposed to Wilson.
I agree. I mean, look, let me quite clear about it. I don't know about you, Michael, but I'm a pretty hardline individual selectionist. So, you know, I think Charles Darwin was, and Michael Ruse is. And so, but you're absolutely right. I think that the swing to group selection is deeply, what shall I say, deeply instructive about Ed Wilson. And this flips me back to the Ed Wilson of the 70s, because one of the things that a lot of people, certainly the philosophers, all took umbrage at was Ed said, you know, throw away everything you've done in ethics and moral philosophy. It's all BS. Although, again, dear Ed would never use language like that. But, you know, it's all BS. And you've got to recognize it's evolutionary biology. But this is the thing. He wanted to say what's happening is evolution is progressive. It leads up to humans. And therefore, humans are of the greatest value. Therefore, what is our moral obligation but to cherish and help humans and push them forward? And of course, the interesting thing is Ed became, as you know, very dedicated to biophilia, to the idea of all organs. But if you look at what Ed is saying, he is not saying like some of the Holmes Ralston, the third, for instance, wants to say that trees have rights in, you know, dignity in their own right. Ed was never like that. Ed was always, if you look at what he says, is don't get rid of these, you know, these plants in the Amazon, because it could well be that they're going to have great medicinal value for human beings. So Ed
in that
was
sense, exactly in that sense, he's not a deep ecologist.
No. But now the interesting thing, the interesting thing is, who is the person who pushed, as it were, progress, evolution, ethics? Herbert Spencer. I mean, and of course, this is what happened. G. Moore went after him and said, "Oh, you're committing the naturalistic fallacy. You can't get is for ought." And I grew up in the 60s. I joke and I say there were three eternal verities. The naturalistic fallacy is right. Even the nicest boys only want one thing, and Americans have terrible table manners. I mean, you know, these were absolute truths. As I say, I still think the naturalistic fallacy is right, and I still, having had 3 boys of my own now, I still distrust even the nicest boys. And American table manners. Well, you know, by God, do you remember this, Michael? They would cut up their meat with a knife, and then they would eat it with a fork. Well, of course, nobody uses knives and forks anyway. It's all fast food, so that's gone by the by. But it was amazing.
We've now got to the point that I really hoped we were going to be able to talk about, as you say, table manners. But I was thinking about Wilson and biophilia, and the fact, as you said, that in a sense it's really a very anthropocentric argument.
Absolutely, completely. And you've got to understand that he is an organicist rather than a mechanist. He goes, I mean, he goes back to Schelling. I doubt that Ed has ever heard of Schelling, let alone read him.
Yes.
But he'd certainly heard of Spencer and read Spencer.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about that. So I see Ed completely in this thing. So you see, for Ed, evolutionary ethics was a natural. Now, as it happens, and I think there were others too, were working towards, we were starting to say, yeah, we think the naturalistic fallacy is right, but, you know, face up to it, folks. The most important truth that we've learned in the last 200 years is, as Thomas Henry Huxley used to say, humans are not, we're not miracles. We're modified mud. That's what we are. That we were not created on the 6th day by a good God. Whether or not God exists, we're the products of evolution. And the fact that we are products of evolution means that even if the naturalistic fallacy is valid, we still have the obligation to take seriously in our philosophy the fact that we are modified. We are, what is it? Modified monkeys rather than modified mud. And that's a lovely way to put it, isn't it? And so a number of us, and I was one, but I think there were others too, in the 80s were trying to say, how can we deal with this? And of course, what we decided was the way to do it is to do an end run around the naturalistic fallacy, is ought, and say, yes, but what we can do in evolutionary ethics is we can show that evolution can tell you why we believe things ethically. We can also show you that that's all you're ever going to get. And so, so in other words, Ed thinks that evolution justifies ethics, whereas somebody like me thinks that evolution explains ethics, but doesn't deny ethics, of course not, but it explains why there can be no objective justification, whether or not it's God's will or whether or not it's the course of evolution. And as you know, Ed and I wrote this, I'd like to say classic paper. I think it is. It's certainly been reprinted a number of times. Where Ed, we say something like, evolution shows us the way forward with ethics. Ed thinks evolution justifies ethics. I think evolution explains away ethics and shows there can be no objective justification. So we knew we got different, but it was, and I'm still proud of it. It was a clarion call to say, philosophers use stupid, and again, another word that Ed would not use, but it begins with A, it ends with holes. But you've got to take seriously, we are modified monkeys, not modified mud. And God damn it, it has to matter when we come to talking about certainly epistemology, but what do we know? But even more about ethics, the whole way that we behave, for instance, with respect to children, that even if they're not our children, if you're passing by and you see a child fallen down and crying, you know in yourself you've got a moral obligation. You cannot just walk by. You might do, but you know that you're doing wrong. I mean, why is this? Well, because we're a social species. I mean, if we were orangutans who had the male, it's wham bam, thank you, ma'am, we'd pass by without a moment's hesitation, but we don't. And so, as I say, a lot of us were feeling that. So this is why, for me, Ed Wilson is, as a philosopher, tremendously important. He showed me the way we should be taking. He did not show me the path I should take, but he certainly showed me the direction in which I should be facing. He turned me round from looking, as it were, back at the bleak thing to looking forward to the fertile valleys. Now, as it happens, my fertile valley was not Ed's fertile valley. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil. Well, actually, can we, I don't want to end without bringing this point in. I think a lot of us, and Ed was never that interested in science and religion. I mean, he talked about it. He grew up as a fundamentalist. He wanted to reach out to fundamentalists, but I don't think he was ever. I don't think he was ever interested in the sorts of things that we are interested in, and that the society of which you're president are interested in. But I think a lot of us, and certainly me, have seen that this, leads us forward to talking about the God issue. And of course, on the one hand, it helps that we got the creationists who are, balmy the one way. On the other hand, it helps we got the new atheists who are balmy the other way. And I should say, the creationists have often disagreed with me, that they have never sneered at me privately or publicly. Whereas my good friend, Richard Dawkins, in The God Delusion, calls me the Neville Chamberlain. Well, I'm the kind of person who would rather be mentioned than not mentioned. I believe that there's no publicity, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And so I'm not about to complain about this, but as you know, I think what has made our society, the sort of raison d'etre of our society, why our society is so unbelievably vital at the moment, is that on the one hand, we don't have but we had the intelligent design people. We've got all the American evangelicals who are basing their views on, why are they anti-abortion? They're not I mean, they're not anti-abortion because it has anything to do with science. Whether or not it's got anything to do with science, that's not where they're at. Actually, it's got nothing to do with Christianity either, because certainly, if you look at St. Augustine, I mean, he thinks abortion is wrong, but he doesn't think it's murder. Neither does Aquinas. So on the one hand, you've got the evangelicals, and then on the other hand, you've got the nutters, he's not, but like Richard Dawkins and some of the others, Dan Dennett, and who, as have been pointed out, are unbelievably ethnocentric, and their prejudice about Muslims. They could give they could give a slave owner a good run for their money when they start talking about Muslims. I mean, and in total ignorance of anything, which holds about Muslims. I mean, I'm not trying to convert you or anybody to Islam, but if I'm going to run it down, I think I should know something about it. So as I say, this is why I find today the science religion issue, which for me is bound up with issues like ethics and these sorts of things. They're not separate things. That's why I find these incredibly exciting and very vital. I've just finished a book to advertise myself on hate, which is coming out with Oxford later this spring, where basically I'm dealing on the one hand with evolution. I'm talking about our evolution as hunter-gatherers and all of that sort of thing. The impact of agriculture, how religion rose up, how religion influences, for instance, things like just war theory, not just Cicero, but Augustine, and all of these things. I mean, it's the most wonderful, what shall I say, mix. And I'm 81. I've just retired after 55 years as a prof, and I have never been more excited about my field than ever before. I mean, I'm going to pass the baton on, and I'm unbelievably happy to do that. I'm an evolutionist. I've had my time. Pass it on to younger people like Anthony Nairn, who, as we discovered, is very good at computers. So he's clearly under 15. Anthony, you've got a whole program ahead of you. But as I say, that's why I think our society is, I'm proud to be a member. I would feel ashamed of myself if I were not a member. There you go. How's that?
And I was just thinking, I think you're right that Fred Wilson, the science religion issue, was not one that interested him. I don't think, frankly, religion interested him very much. Most of his adult life, he seems to have said very little about it, except that he thought it would be cannibalized by a good understanding of biologists. And when pushed, I think he described himself quite often as an agnostic, but a bit like Darwin himself, towards the end of his life, he was more comfortable identifying as an atheist, I think.
Darwin, I think, no. Darwin, at the end of his life, said, I'm an agnostic. He said, I'm not a hardline.
Yeah.
Oh, Ed Wilson?
Yeah, he got a bit more clear in a sense about identifying. I mean, well, as you know, Darwin, going back to Darwin, his autobiography, it may have been technically agnostic, but nevertheless.
I always had a feeling that Ed Wilson is a bit like my wife, Lizzie. There are agnostics like me who worry about it non-stop ever since I lost my faith as a Quaker when I was 20. And people like me who, Julian Huxley was another, and Thomas Henry Huxley, being an agnostic means that's just the start. And then you've got people like my wife who basically are not sure about the relationship between Abraham and Isaac, and they're not terribly keen. Maybe they were gay lovers, and I say, no, it's David and Jonathan who are the gay lovers. I'm a Quaker, and because Quakers don't read the Bible, but I have an incredible knowledge of the Bible because I've given so many talks where I've had to sleep in a hotel in a strange part of the world where I couldn't sleep in the middle of the night. And what is the only reading material available? The Gideon Bible. So, if Michael, you're an Anglican priest. I bet I've spent more time reading the Old Testament than you have.
I'm quite happy conceding that. As you intimated a minute or two ago, we better draw this saddish conclusion. But it's always fun talking with you, Michael. And, thank you, because apart from your academic work that's directly relevant to Ed Wilson's life, you are somebody who worked with him and knew him for, over 40 years or so. So that's really, really appreciated. Keep well, but I think we'll finish there.
Let me just put one final plug in, folks. Michael, Reiss, and I have been working on a book on the new atheists. No, I'm sorry, the new biology. The new biology. What the hell am I saying? And I think, let me put it this way. It's now with the referees. And I think after, 5 years, this is the first time we've had a version where if it was sent to me to referee, I would say, accept this. So there you go.
Nicely put to end with. Thanks ever so much. Keep well, Michael, as always.
And you too.
Cheers
Thanks
then.
a lot.
Bye.
Goodbye.